Terry was born in 1911. His grandfather was a judge in India. It's an Irish family. His father, Frank Rattigan, Major Frank Rattigan, was a diplomat, a fairly licentious diplomat at that, who finally got fired from the diplomatic service for an affair with the Princess of Greece of the day. Terry was one of two brothers. His elder brother Brian had been born just before him, but he was born. His maternal grandmother, whose house it was in Kensington, was effectively the family home, because Frank and his wife disappeared to Tangier and various other places. And so Terry was a pretty lonely boy. And it was his grandmother who first took him to the pantomime and first gave him his love of the theatre. He went away to school as a small boy and then followed his father, Frank, to Harrow, where his father had cut a very considerable figure. He was a very dashing sportsman and captain of the first 11 cricket team. Terry was also a fine cricketer, perhaps not quite as fine as his father, but nevertheless was in the first 11 from a very early age, and had a flair for Latin. In fact, one of his characters was based on the Latin master at Harrow. The Browning version, the Croc, is based on his Latin master. But while he was at Harrow, he developed, I suppose, what you might describe as his first full-scale homosexual affair. Nevertheless, Terry had a successful career at Harrow. He wrote a play or two. He'd been trying to write a play since his prep school at Sandroyd in Dorset. He'd written sort of outlines of plays and little ideas for plays. And he was fascinated by the Greek playwrights. He went to Oxford. He went up to Oxford, to Trinity. And it was there that he first really discovered what the theatre was all about. The Oxford University Dramatic Society, OUDS, was a very powerful force in the 1930s at Oxford. Many people went there, and many went on to be very considerable figures in the theatre. It was there that he first met John Gielgud and John Perry, who were to become significant influences on his later career. And it was there too that he got his first taste for acting. A small walk-on part in a very famous production that Gielgud launched with Peggy Ashcroft of Romeo and Juliet. I think Terry learned pretty quickly that acting wasn't his game, but he loved the theatre. And so he decided, well, I think he decided some time before, that he would continue to write. And he wrote a play, actually quite a successful little play called First Episode, which was put on in the then Kew Theatre in Kew, near Kew Bridge in London, and got a transfer into the Comedy, then the Comedy Theatre, now the Pinter Theatre in the West End. It convinced Terry that he didn't need to complete his degree and that he could give up and become a full-time dramatist. He decided he would go back and live with his father, who by this time had been dishonourably discharged from the diplomatic service, and his father was very against this, thought it was a dreadful idea, but nevertheless agreed, after a good deal of argument, that he should have a go. Terry's mother, Vera, Frank's wife, was very supportive of her son, indeed continued to be throughout his life, and she died only a few years before he did, ironically. So with that in mind, and with the success of a play actually on in the West End, however briefly, Terry set out to become a playwright. It wasn't an easy road. The fact that Terry was gay was an absolute central part of his character. He never denied it, except to his mother, to whom he never admitted it. He would allow his father to entertain his conquests, because his father was a great womanizer, in his flat in Mayfair, while his boyfriend, who was living upstairs, sat on the stairs waiting for his father and the girlfriend to leave. He was always had a permanent lover and then a series of others. Homosexuality was Terry's entire life, but of course, as everyone knows, at that point it was illegal, and to be found out practicing as a homosexual could lead to imprisonment. So the concealment that Terry wanted to do anyway, apart from among his own gay friends, was an essential part of his own artistic, creative flair. Concealment is absolutely the central word in a great deal of what Rattigan wrote. There's a phrase he used near the end of his life: "What do we do?" And the character, Terry's character, says, "We pretend like hell." And that's exactly what Terry did. He pretended like hell. To his mother, he was always saying, "Well, Margaret Leighton's pursuing me," or he would say, "Oh, I met this extraordinary woman on the Cunard coming back from America, and I mean, she's frightfully keen, but I'm going to get off at Naples. I want to avoid her." I mean, that was the dual life that he always led. And it would be impossible to explain Rattigan's plays. I don't think this is true of his films, but it would be impossible to explain Rattigan's plays without reference to the fact that he was a closet homosexual, that he was gay but didn't want to admit it. And even at the end of his life, even after the reforms, after the homosexuality had become, well, if not acceptable, at least not illegal anymore, Terry was still very, very reluctant to come out. It was instilled in him that he was to pretend to be a very sophisticated, well-off, unmarried, but extremely available man. Terry struggled to write a commercial play. He wanted to be a West End playwright. He didn't want to write for what we would now call the fringe theatre. He wanted to write for the bright lights of Shaftesbury Avenue. He was not interested in any way in intellectual pursuits, particularly. He wanted to be a success. He wanted his name in lights, and he wanted to be the figure of the day. He was inspired more by Pinero and Maugham than he was by lesser well-known playwrights. He admired Gerald de Maurier. He was a devotee of the commercial theatre. He wrote, finally, in 1935, a play called French Without Tears. It wasn't its original title, but that's what it became. And there was a moment in 1936 when a gap appeared in the Criterion Theatre on Piccadilly Circus, a 4-week black period. The show that had been running was a failure. They took it off, and there wasn't another one due to start until early November. Harold French, who was then a director, had been an actor, became a director, had seen this play called French Without Tears, which essentially tells the story of life in a French crammers, and thought, well, it's a trifle. We'll put it on. There's a hole. Nobody's going to get paid much. Ironically, it starred Rex Harrison, then an unknown, forming a friendship with Terry, which was to last the rest of Rex's life. The play in rehearsal was a disaster. In fact, on the final dress rehearsal, Harold French said to the entire company, "That was so bad, we shall have to do it all over again." Terry was convinced it would be a failure. Absolutely no hope whatever. In fact, it became an enormous success very, very quickly. Suddenly, everybody wanted to go and see this rather bright young man's play. He was only 25. This bright young man's play, which is funny and light and sophisticated and contains witty lines. And from being no one, Terry, within a year, had become the new young thing, the new great British playwright. He'd never met David Lean. Indeed, Lean's idea for the sound barrier, which Terry wrote in the back end of 1951 into 1952, had formed his mind after he'd seen an evening news report of the death of Sir Geoffrey de Havilland, whose son was killed on his first solo flight. And Lean thought that this attempt to break the sound barrier was a modern adventure story. And he started to go to talk to pilots and to talk to aircraft manufacturers about why were they obsessed with this and what was the drama in it and how did it work. And he made a great big 300-page diary of all these conversations, including about 12 scenes for a movie. Alexander Korda, who had desperately wanted to work with Lean, knew that David had an idea and said, well, let's talk about it. Lean enthused Korda in his office, and Korda said, without any hesitation, I think we should get Terence Rattigan to write it. He would do it brilliantly. Picked up the phone, Lean and Korda in the same room, same time, picked up the phone, rang Rattigan and said, I've got this idea. David Lean's got this diary. And Terry was not at all keen. Well, I don't know anything about jets, and I'm not sure that technology is not really my thing, and I'm good at relationships. So Korda and Lean said to him, well, look, come and talk to us about it. Terry went to a meeting, and Lean gave him the diary with his own notes in it. And they said, well, come and meet some of the plane makers, the people at de Havilland who were creating the Comet, and the first proper jetliner, the first commercial jetliner. And Terry went to meet them with Lean and was enormously impressed. He said, they're not a bit like the chaps I flew with in the war. They're really quite quiet, and they're not at all assuming, and it's not bravado, it's all very controlled. And I think that was what really appealed to Terry, that these men were controlled. They weren't twirling their moustaches and, always carrying a Labrador in the back of the sports car. They were rather serious. And so Terry agreed to write the screenplay. When he'd completed it, he took it to Lean and Lean's then assistant producer, and they both didn't like it at all. Terry had written about a plane maker, Sir John Ridgway, his son, another son, and somehow it didn't work. It was Korda, when he saw the draft, said, oh, no. Why don't you make one of those two sons of the plane maker a daughter? And she marries the test pilot. That way you have a trilogy. There is a triangle at the heart of the film. And Terry, to his eternal credit, said, you're absolutely right. I should have thought of that. Father-daughter is a much more powerful relationship than father-son. And the film script was duly amended to reflect that. It would be fair to say that Alexander Korda had another agenda. He was very keen that the film should star David Lean's then wife, Anne Todd, and the concept of having a daughter in a principal role in relationship to Sir John Ridgway, eventually played by Ralph Richardson, was very important. It might be worth saying Lean and Anne Todd were not getting on. In fact, their relationship fractured probably forever during the filming of The Sound Barrier. In fact, Lean confessed to one of his crew at one point, never put your wife in a picture. It's a disaster. And indeed, this was the last film they ever made together. But what that gave, what the casting of Anne Todd and the creation of a daughter for Sir John Ridgway gave the film, was an emotional depth that just having a group of men, plane makers and test pilots, didn't have. But there's no doubt that Terry was extremely proud of The Sound Barrier. It was a film that he felt he brought something to. It was an original screenplay. It wasn't reworking his own work or somebody else's. And he was very proud that he was nominated for an Oscar for original screenplay for it. It won the Best British Film Academy Award as Best Film of the Year. He was nominated for the screenplay. It was very successful, the 12th most successful film of 1952, according to the Motion Picture Herald in the United States. The most successful was The Greatest Show on Earth, directed by Cecil B. DeMille, but that's by the by. It was much admired by the new Queen, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, whose father had only died 3 or 4 months before the film was released on 24th of July 1952. She liked it very much. The then Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, returned to office after the election 1951, was also a huge admirer and demanded a special screening of it. It made a great deal of money. Interestingly too, David Lean liked it very much too. He was immensely proud of it, and at a particular meeting 35 years later, near the end of David's life, when he was asked what film he would like to show to an assembled group of technicians, master technicians, he did not choose Lawrence of Arabia. He did not choose Bridge on the River Kwai. He chose The Sound Barrier because he thought it showed his grasp of the cinema at its height. And it also demonstrated that perhaps for the first time he could use a large canvas. The scenes in the air, which weren't incidentally shot by David, they were shot by the second unit, but never mind, showed a breadth that would then reappear on the River Kwai and in Lawrence and in Ryan's Daughter. Basically, Rattigan wasn't ever a great researcher. He met a couple of pilots. Basically, Terry wrote it out of his head. He had an idea for the relationships, which didn't quite work, so he went back and redid it. He knew what the emotions were: risk, uncertainty. Do you really love me? One of his questions, of all questions in all of his work. How does that love show itself? And to some extent, he brought his father, Frank, Major Frank Rattigan, to life in the figure of Sir John Ridgway. In many ways, Sir John Ridgway is Frank Rattigan. Domineering, single-minded, difficult, cold, except when it came to girls, young girls. A man who wasn't capable of what you might describe as much in the way of affection. He was a martinet who never listened to anyone except himself. So he brought his own research, but he wasn't a man who sat on the top of a bus, as Alan Bennett always says he does, and listened to conversations. Terry didn't really do that.
Well, what is it, Dad?
Galaxy in Andromeda.
How far away is that?
Oh, about 700,000 light years.
You mean that what I'm seeing now is the way this galaxy looked 700,000 years ago?
That's right.
I'm looking into the past then, aren't I?
In a manner of speaking.
Is there a way of looking into the future?
Yes.
How?
Through that telescope. What you see there is the past, the present, and the future, all in one. The process of continuous creation. Stars die, stars are born. No beginning, no end. Yes, you can see into the future out there, all right.
Many of the
Nice hobby you
characteristics
got
of
here.
every Rattigan play can be found in the sound barrier. Reserve, for example. Never expressing anything too dramatically. No hysteria. Lots of control. Lots of care. Oh no, we mustn't, that's a subject we shouldn't touch on. We can touch on it elliptically, but no, that's far too close to the bone. After all, we must keep up appearances. We must preserve the mask. That element of Rattigan is abundantly clear in the sound barrier. And it's also abundantly clear in, for example, the Browning version, or, for example, the Deep Blue Sea. It is that, what I suppose was then called a stiff upper lip, that absolutely held firm throughout the sound barrier, no matter what would have happened. There's no weeping in the sound barrier. It's not a Rattigan quality. You would never find a Rattigan woman weeping. You would never find a Rattigan woman sobbing on the side of the stage, any more than you'd find a Rattigan man being over-affected. Rattigan had an enormous respect for David Lean. After all, this was the man who'd done Oliver Twist and Great Expectations. He thought that Lean was a wonderful filmmaker. But Terry wasn't a great lover of film sets. He found it very dull, a lot of sitting about and waiting for nothing to happen. And besides, he was preparing the Deep Blue Sea, along with Frisk Banbury, its director, for its West End opening. So he just let David get on with it. He was very admiring of it when he saw a cut. But as far as he was concerned, that was a job done. Terry was very much a commercial screenwriter. You pay me for a screenplay, I'll provide you with a screenplay. After that, it's over to you. I'm keeping entirely out of the way. Do with it whatever you want. Rattigan was enormously proud of the sound barrier. Mostly, I suspect, because it was a totally original screenplay. He would never have thought of writing that himself. It's not an idea he would ever have had. But it was a perfect example for him to demonstrate to the world that he was literally a master craftsman when it came to creating stories. And that gave him enormous pleasure. And the fact that he was a huge success gave him even greater pleasure. I mean, Noel Coward rang him up when it was playing at the Plaza in Piccadilly Circus, now no longer there, sadly, and said, congratulations, dear boy, you've beaten my record at the Plaza. And that was for a film which gave David Lean his start, In Which We Serve, in which Lean was the editor and Coward was the director and the star. Terry viewed his Oscar nomination, much as he viewed many other awards, as something of a sideshow. What interested him far more was the box office receipts and whether he had a percentage of the gross or not. When it came to baubles, he wasn't too fussed. They weren't anything that ever particularly interested him. He wasn't wild about award ceremonies or award dinners or anything like that. He seemed quite happy to have dinner on his own or with friends. Terry was obviously flattered. No one wouldn't be, and he certainly was. He was very flattered by the attention of Hollywood, and it helped, there is no doubt, his career as a screenwriter in the 60s, because it had such a good reputation and was much liked, although retitled for America, Breaking the Sound Barrier. But it gave him a reputation in Hollywood which he could then return to. And indeed, when his theatrical work plummeted off a cliff in the second half of the 1950s in London, almost the only thing that he turned to was writing screenplays. And at one point boasted in a famous letter to Kenneth Tynan, "I'm now the highest paid screenwriter in the world." Terry was much more interested in that claim and truth than he was in the fact that he'd been Oscar nominated. It was, I think, Rattigan's knighthood was, I think, the pinnacle of his career. He was exceptionally proud. After all, very, very few playwrights had been knighted before him, Somerset Maugham and Arthur Wing Pinero, but it was a very rare honour. He was thrilled by it. It seemed to him, I think, to finally confirm his place in the pantheon of the 20th century's finest English dramatists. Sadly, in my view, it didn't. Indeed, it was going to take another 30 years before people realised just how good a playwright he had been. He had become rather an antique figure, no longer quite relevant to modern theatre in the wake of Look Back in Anger. He was, however, an absolutely extraordinarily talented playwright who is now finally being recognised as such. And the knighthood meant to him that he had been acknowledged, that he did represent one of the great English playwrights of the 20th century, even if the critics might not agree.